So, good morning, everybody, and welcome once again to our webinar, Mental Health and Our Changing Climate, Impacts, Implications, and Practices. This webinar is a collaborative effort between the BC Climate and Health Network and also the BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative. My name is Kate Murphy, and I'm joined on this call by my colleague Shannon Gilchrist from Fraser Basin Council, as well as Carrie Klein from Shift Collaborative, and some wonderful presenters who are going to be introduced more in full soon. I'm joining this webinar from the territories of Tsawwassen Nation, Musqueam Nation, Stolo Nation, Kwantlen Nation, Stamanis Nation, and Katzie Nation in Ladner, BC. And I've spent most of my life here. I've worked here previously and I'm now working here with COVID, but I have Irish and Dutch ancestry and I am an uninvited guest on this territory. And as an uninvited guest, I know that I also have a duty to learn about my place in this colonial structure, how this structure benefits me as a settler, and also what I can do to dismantle these systems of harm that are still in place here in this province and also in this country. Thank you all for joining from the territories that you hail from as well. This webinar was planned by two organizations, Fraser Basin Council, representing the BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative, as well as the BC Climate and Health Network, which Carrie will introduce after this. The BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative supports local governments, Indigenous nations, and industries in planning for climate change adaptation. And we have a resource website at retooling.ca that just underwent a refresh. It looks much snazzier than it has in the past. So I recommend you check that out if you would like some adaptation resources or funding opportunities or want to check out some events. Over to you, Carrie.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Kate, and good morning, everyone. I see there's some people still joining us, so welcome. My name is Carrie Klein. I work with an organization called Shift Collaborative. I'm joining today this session as a settler on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And I'm just really grateful for the ancestors who've cared for this land and these territories that now cares for me and my family and community. So I'm really excited about this session today, really honored to be moderating the session, and really thrilled to host and invite all of you into this discussion. Shift Collaborative really has an interest of working at that intersection of climate change, health, and equity. We also are part of this informal network, the BC Climate and Health Network, that has an interest in sharing knowledge and ideas and practices to advance this work in BC. So you can just go to the next slide, please, Kate. So the purpose of today's session, we know that there are many ways that our mental health is impacted by climate change. Some of you on the line today may have experience being impacted directly by the trauma of living through some of the climate-related disasters like wildfires or floods or extreme weather. And I know many of us are experiencing a type of eco-anxiety or climate grief about the future of the planet. So I know over the last few years, we have consistently heard that there's a real desire from a number of different sectors, not only to better understand the impact of climate change on mental health, but also to build our own capacity as practitioners, as decision makers, as change makers, to support psychological and social resilience, both in our communities, in our organizations, but as well as in our own personal lives. And so what we're hoping to do today in this conversation is three things. The first is to offer some framing around the psychological impacts of climate change on mental health and well-being, and also discuss how those impacts may look different across different populations and communities. The second is to explore examples of how some organization communities are working with the psychological dimensions of climate change through different lenses. So we have an incredible panel of presenters today who will be speaking about this from a capacity building lens, from an emergency response lens, a decolonizing lens, and also a youth lens. And then last, we want to invite you in to reflect with us on what are some practices and tools that practitioners can use in our work intentionally to more intentionally include the mental health dimensions of climate change. So back over to you, Kate.
We have three fantastic presenters here with us today, and Carrie's going to be introducing them more fully before they speak, but just to introduce them quickly now, Dr. Elaine Lertzman, founder and lead of Project Inside Out, and researcher, author, and educator will be our first presenter today. Judy Wu, a Master of Public Health graduate student and sustainability scholar from UBC, will go after Dr. Renee Lertzman. And Dr. Emily Dickin, who is the Director of North Shore Emergency Management, will be our final speaker today. And we'll take some questions between each speaker, as well as have a more fulsome moderated discussion with Judy and Emily at the end. Renee unfortunately has to leave a little bit early because she has a very busy schedule, but she will take a little bit extra Q&A right after her presentation. A few webinar logistics before we get into it. Please keep your audio muted. If you have any questions, you can put them at any time in the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. And for any technical difficulties, Shannon's on the line to provide technical support. So you can put those into the question box at any time and she'll help you out, or feel free to email fraserbasin@gmail.com and she'll also connect with you there. So I have a couple of poll questions just to get us started to let us know a little bit more about you before we go into our first presentation. So Shannon, if you could bring up the second poll question. Thank you so much. So I'll give folks about 20 seconds to fill this one out. Okay, we have about 70% of people answering, so I will close it now. So for affiliations, so again, we have folks across the board here, but quite a few local and provincial and federal government folks. Health sector folks makes sense. Nonprofit youth and community organizations, as well as some folks from Indigenous nations and academia. Welcome to all of you. And Shannon, if you don't mind doing the last poll as well. We wanted to get a bit of a sense of what you would all like to learn about during today's webinar. Just before we begin, these are all things that will be covered to some extent, but we kind of want to see what you're most interested in for your own preferences. And again, I'll give you maybe about 10 more seconds to fill that out. Okay, great. Okay.
It looks like a lot of you are interested in learning tools and practices and also better understanding how climate change impacts mental health. Well, it looks like we want to learn about all these things, so we'll do our best. And I also wanted to mention just one thing. I know we all live on Zoom these days, and in the chat on Zoom, everybody can see what you're typing. So just so you're aware, what you're typing in the chat, we can see as hosts, and we will rebroadcast your questions when we get to that point of the webinar.
All right, so I'll pass it to you now, Carrie, for starting these wonderful presentations.
Great, thanks. So Renee, you can share your video. That would be great. So I'm really excited and honored to introduce our first panelist. So Dr. Renee Lertzman, she's joining us from California today. And Renee is an educator, a researcher, an eco-engagement strategist, and she uses psychological insights to change our approach to the environmental crisis. So she comes to this work as a psychosocial researcher, and she uses frameworks and methods that empower people to take action and create impact on climate and sustainability issues. She works with organizations all over the world and also recently launched a fantastic project called Project Inside Out, which she will introduce us to more in her presentation. So Renee, I'm so pleased to welcome you. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Carrie. I thought you might mention our history.
I had the privilege of Renee being my master's thesis supervisor, oh gosh, 10 years ago.
Yep, that was an amazing experience. So it's it's really lovely to reconnect with you in this way a decade later. I'm going to set a timer actually just to keep us on track here. So hi everyone. I can't see you, but I can do my best to tune in to you all from where you're beaming in. So I want to start with some level setting here. So I come to this work having not experienced any actual distinction between mental health and climate and the environment. So it goes back for me from when I was a young person, especially in college, when I was starting to learn more about what was happening environmentally and with climate. And I was a psychology major. So at that time, I was convinced I was going to become a psychologist, but very early in the my experience as a young person, I found myself so profoundly impacted by what I was learning about, and I was very confused by why this wasn't the topic that we were talking about. Why was it that I was going into a lecture hall and learning about issues that were impacting communities, ecosystems, viability of the planet, and so forth? So for me, it's always been a psychological domain to be working in. So it's been about 30 years now that I've been looking at how can we leverage what we know at this point from the psychological sectors that can really support our capacities to respond and engage with creativity and resilience and proactivity and ingenuity and all those things that we as humans are capable of. How can we navigate the paradox that the more the higher the stakes, the more stress we're under, the more anxiety we experience, the harder it is for us as humans generally to be at our best selves, that it tends to create a contraction, a turning away. And then adding into that the disparities of impact, the vulnerability of communities who are already under pressure, already under stress. How do we come to terms with that? How do we deal with the human tendency to want to avoid and deny what's difficult and threatening? So to me, that's the ultimate psychosocial conundrum. As Carrie mentioned, I'm trained as a psychosocial researcher, meaning that there really isn't much of a separation between what we think of as kind of individual psychology and social psychology. So I want to share with you in just the brief time that we have where I've been going with this work and some tools and resources that I've been putting together since I left academia, which was about 10 years ago. My first, I was training and had a research post. I left that in about 2011, and then that's when I met Carrie and started teaching at Royal Roads. And interestingly, the experience working with the community of practitioners at Royal Roads over a number of years really helped hone this practice that I'm going to be sharing with you here, in addition to a lot of client work that I started doing at that time. So as a way of kind of setting the landscape here, I want to just remind us that, while I've been doing this work, there have not been many voices making these connections, and now that's changed. So this is just a snapshot of some articles that were coming out. This was probably about a year ago or so, but it was literally within a week or two that we just started seeing March, April, May of 2020, a lot of headlines, a lot of media attention around climate grief, eco-anxiety, that this has really become such a key theme in the public domain, hence this panel that's happening right now. So this is actually a really good thing, because one of the most powerful things that we can do is we can talk about this and we can name this. It's when it's not being named, like it was when I was young years ago, that's when things really are really challenging to build the tools and capacities to engage with these issues. So fast forward to now, and this is a paper that just came out in July 2020. Now we're seeing incredible research that's being done. Some of you may be familiar with Ashley Consulo's work. We were on a National Public Radio episode on Science Friday. This is how I got to first meet her and get to know her work. Really powerful stuff. And so I actually wanted to include this quote because there's so much in this piece. First of all, this is in the Lancet. Okay, so this is a mainstream, highly credible scientific journal, and now this work is really being acknowledged in those spaces, which is a huge advance. So what the authors say here is that what I want to draw our attention to is what they're saying is that ecological grief and anxiety over current losses or anticipated future change are a sign of relationship with or connection to the natural world. So that's number one. That's an incredibly important assertion. Number two, what is needed are accessible and safe spaces to explore these difficult emotional reactions, the political will to ensure that important strategies and supports are funded, and the research required to strengthen and support approaches of healing and resilience. Recognizing emotions are often what leads people to act. It is possible that feelings of ecological anxiety and grief, although uncomfortable, are in fact the crucible through which humanity must pass to harness the energy and conviction needed for the life-saving changes now. So there's a lot to unpack here, and in a way, this is the thesis of all of my work I'm doing and everything I'm about to talk to you about, and I imagine this panel, which is that accessible and safe spaces to explore these difficult emotional reactions are actually what give rise and enable political will and the research needed, so that these are all totally integral, that it's no longer about this is something that you kind of go off and sort of try to process on your own. The incredible shift that's happening right now is a much more relationship-centered and much more emotionally intelligent, oriented approach to organizing, to action, to mobilization that is just at the very beginning and is starting to take off. So just wanted to recognize that this is a field that's developing. These are a group of women. They do happen to be a group of white women. Not to say this is only, they're a true representation of the field. These are colleagues of mine. These are people who have been on the forefront of true pioneering climate and environmental psychology. Caroline Hickman in the UK, Leslie Davenport, Wendy Greenspun, Lise Van Susteren, Britt Ray, who is Canadian, doing really important work. I want to do a shout out specifically to Britt Ray's work. You may know of her work. She's got a newsletter called Generation Dread. She's an advisor with Project Inside Out. She's a really good resource for understanding the landscape of this field. The other folks listed here are clinicians who have been forging new ways of practice in a clinical setting and partnering with activists. So I want to move now into kind of doing the level set around where we're at when we think about ecological anxiety and grief, which is that for a number of years, there's been this kind of binary between despair and hope. And that, you know, this is what I hear a lot, and I'm asked this a lot, which is, should we feel hope and how do we deal with despair? And you know, one of the things that's really important to recognize is that there really isn't such a thing as a binary or dichotomy, that these are very fluid, interrelating experiences and legitimate experiences to be had in relation to what's happening. The other tendency we have is to think of this in terms of good news, or bad news and solutions. And I would want to suggest that we blow that up as well, that the question is not really about, how do we, whether we should talk about what's happening that might depress people or shut people down or make people feel anxious. It's really not about that. It's really about it's about how do we communicate from a more skillful, integrated, emotionally intelligent way. A lot of folks working in these issues, it's very natural to feel like we have to sort of try to persuade and convince other people to care about these issues as much as we do. And, I include this in this session because this, for one thing, this is a flawed assumption that it's on us to do that, but it also has a very profound toll on us emotionally if we feel that it's up to us to try to persuade and incentivize other people. And so what I want to offer is a different way of looking at this. So Project Inside Out, it's a new hub. It was just launched recently. It's in very early stages. And the premise of Project Inside Out is that we, doing this work skillfully is an inside and outside job. It's like we have to do some of the inner work, which means looking and working with our own anxieties, our own ambivalence, our own concerns, all of that, to bring that into the context of the work we do, and to bring that to those that we're seeking to work with and engage with. So I saw a number of folks working in government and NGOs. All of this work has direct relevance for how you develop more of an attuned way of engaging with people that gets away from that assumption that you have to motivate people, you have to get people to care, but rather trying to understand where people might be feeling overwhelmed, might be feeling anxious, and connecting with people more on that level. So Project Inside Out, it's the URL is projectinsideout.net, is basically an approach that pulls together insights and best practices primarily from the more clinical psychology and neuroscientific realms, combined with systems thinking and some contemplative mindfulness practice. And the premise is that we now need to find a new way of engaging that's actually not about the hope and despair, kind of trying to motivate people, but a different approach. And really the emphasis here is that we need to become and behave more like guides. And there's much more on the website about guiding. But guiding is really a way of being very relationship oriented and tuned into the anxieties and grief and experiences that people may be having. And it positions ourselves in a very different dynamic in our work, including how we design our engagement strategy, whether you're at the government level, the city level, whether you're working with a startup, whether you're working in a multinational company. It's really about how do we show up more as guides. And guiding is really a new mindset to do this work. It really is not a lightweight thing. It has to do with being able to look at our own sense of urgency and our need for change, and to work with that in a way that can be more sensitive and skillful. And I want to acknowledge that this work is really grounded in the research of motivational interviewing. So one of our advisors is a trainer in motivational interviewing, which is an evidence-based body of work. It's the real kind of primary approach in the public health sector to working with people on change. And it was developed by clinicians who, oh gosh, I have to wrap this up quickly. It was developed by clinicians who were really trying to work with people on hard change, and found that it's through a mode of guiding that really does the trick. So I'm going to actually skip through. This is all on Project Inside Out website. What I want to actually end this wrap this up with, is what I call the 3 A's. And again, this is in the category, as Carrie mentioned, in terms of this panel, this webinar. This is in the tools kind of capability kind of category of how can we bring this into the people that we're working with. And one of those ways is by being sensitive to what these 3 A's are. Here's my alarm. And that is a shift from, again, trying to get people to care to asking what anxieties, ambivalence, and concerns and aspirations they may have. So this is what I have found over working with a number of organizations is pretty game changing. I've seen people actively change their whole theory of change by taking some time with these 3 A's and reflecting on what might be going on with your stakeholders, with the communities you're working with that bring up a lot of anxiety, and then how do you meet that through the lens of containing safe spaces, acknowledging all of those things that are now pretty normal and kind of considered ordinary emotional intelligence, but take considerable skill. So anxiety is really like, it's the first A. What might be up for people? And ambivalence is the second A, which is where are people feeling in conflict and really torn. And this I have here as sort of the buried lead, meaning that we don't talk nearly enough about the conflicts that people are in, the way that people often feel very torn between their aspirations and their attachments to practices that are damaging and destructive. And as you know, in a Canadian context, this is very profound in the regions that are most connected with industry and with extractive industries, you know, where people are feeling truly caught in double binds. That is a really, really key area that we want to be honing in on, because it's very painful to be in a double bind, and it leads to this kind of feeling paralyzed. And the third A is aspiration, which is what really drives and motivates and inspires us, which really, again, we already know a lot about humans. We know that we want to feel that we contribute, that we have a value, that we're part of something bigger, that we're on the good side of history. Like, we all have that desire. But the question for us as change makers is, how do we work with people and partner and guide and draw out the wisdom and the resources and the capabilities that are already within these communities and individuals, that it's not about us trying to push and pull, but really it's about us inviting and designing a mode of working with people and communities that recognizes these aspirations, but comes at it from the lens of, how do we amplify, how do we co-elevate, how do we co-develop each other? So I think because I'm at time, I'm going to leave it at that for now. There's more to be said for sure, but I suggest that you go to the website and you check out, there's a quiz on, we can stop sharing my screen now. If you can, oh, there we go. Thank you. So there's a quiz on Project Inside Out, for example, that helps you understand kind of how you're showing up. Are you kind of showing up more as a cheerleader, as an educator, as a righteous moralizer, as a guide? But that kind of self-reflection is really a big, big part of building capabilities in organizations. So thank you for having
Thank you, Renee. We probably just scratched the surface, but that was fantastic. I will put an invitation to anyone if you have a question for Renee. We won't get to many, but if you wanted to put a question in the chat, in the question box, then we can see that and we can bring those forward to her. But Renee, just there's so many things that were in that presentation that I'd love to explore more. And we don't have a lot of time, but I mean, something that really stood out for me was that slide with that quote. And it was almost like a silver lining, that grief is a sign of connection to the natural world. And it might be this key for finding out how we can get more momentum to make progress on some of these really, really complex issues like climate change. And that we need safe spaces to explore that together. So I have a bit of a practical question for you. Like, I know you support practitioners all over the world to think about how they can use some of these tools, create safe spaces in their organizations or workplaces to begin this work. There's lots of people on the call that work in institutions, government organizations, kind of big nonprofits, small community organizations. What's one thing that you would recommend organizations can do to begin to be more intentional about understanding and including some of these inner dimensions that you've been discussing? Like, what's a good
Okay, so I would say 3 things off the top of my head. One is find people in your community who are trained at clinicians who have that background, and partner with them and innovate and come up with practices that you can bring into your team, into your organization, that build trust and safe spaces and build that resilience from the inside of the organizational culture and the team. It doesn't have to be psychology. I mean, there's a lot of wisdom in community grassroots organizations, indigenous communities. So I'm not valorizing psychology, but I am saying that there's a skill set there that we could be leveraging. 2 would be to make it a routine as a team to tune into the anxieties, the 3 A's that you imagine your stakeholders and communities are experiencing, but more than imagine, actually do the work of gathering insights and listening, deep listening and tuning in. And 3 is your ability to reflect that back and to mirror your empathy and understanding of how painful these things might be, and to notice when we fall into the trap of cheerleading and feeling like we have to be really inspiring all the time and we have to try to motivate people all the time. But in actuality, if you just name and acknowledge, like, yeah, this is painful stuff and this is hard and that's why we're doing this work and why you're part of it, that's a more tuned in approach that people can start experimenting with.
Yeah. Love it. Thank you, Renee. There's one question from Brianna in the chat that I'm going to bring forward, and I'm going to blend it with a question I had. So her question was, how can we scale up some of this work when it's so based on relationship building? And I'm sensing there's a tension in there about the urgency around kind of, we need to solve some of these issues in the next 10 years, 12 years. We need a lot of quick progress that's transformational. So there's a bit of a tension or a paradox there, and some of this work likely does move slow. It's about building our capacity to, build trust and resilience from the inside. So do you have any thoughts on that, about scaling up and meeting the sense of urgency at this moment?
Yeah, so 1, train the trainer. Like, we just basically need to be building capabilities at scale for people to have more effective interactions with each other. So the paradox of change is that it happens very quickly when people feel connected, that there's relationship is happening. We don't have time not to, so it's really about how do you scale that. There's so many examples already where, let's just take the one example of passing gay marriage in the United States that was attributed largely to a kind of what's called deep canvassing, where people were, all kinds of ordinary people were trained to have conversations with people about, the topic of gay marriage through the lens of listening, active listening, motivational interviewing, and it worked, and it was done very quickly and at scale. So I think we just need to be shifting our mindset about what it means to have a relationship-driven approach to organizing and to social change. Is, that's why on the Project Inside Out site, we spend a lot of time talking about equipping. That's one of the 5 guiding principles, is to equip people with the tools and resources to have these conversations.
Mm-hmm. That's a great place to end. I wish we had more time, but everyone can find Renee at the Project Inside Out website. I know a few of you are asking for contact information, and her slides will be shared, so we can make those available to everybody through a PDF.
I just want to do a shout out to Adam Lerner, who's, I think, in this session, who has an organization. Check out Adam Lerner's work, Solvable, and his newsletter. Sorry, Adam, I'm spacing on the name of your newsletter, but it's beautiful. There are people all around the country who are doing really deep, thoughtful work. So just find them and partner with them.
Yeah, partnerships and collaboration. That's a great note to end on. Okay, thanks so much, Renee. I know you'll be with us for a
Thanks for
little.
having me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
take care. Thanks. So thanks, Renee. And Judy is our next panelist, and I'll invite Judy to turn her video on. Great. Hi, Judy. Welcome. So Judy, Renee introduced a really great orienting frame for us, I think, around eco-anxiety, eco-grief, how some of these complex emotions are part of how we're being impacted by climate change, and how they're also part of how we need to be responding. And so we're really pleased to have Judy Wu join us as the next panelist. And Judy is a Master's of Public Health student at University of British Columbia. And she's brought her passion for mental health advocacy and her interest in climate action together in her research to focus on the health effects of climate and eco-anxiety in young people. So she is a sustainability scholar through the UBC Sustainability Program, and she's been looking at methods that address climate and eco-anxiety within individuals and communities. So Judy has been pulling together a report that has a lot of examples of how organizations and communities are addressing eco-anxiety. So she'll be sharing that at the end of the presentation. But I'll turn it over to you, Judy, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions after.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carrie. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me and you can see my slides. Is that correct?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so again, hi everyone. Thanks so much for signing on for my presentation today. As Carrie mentioned, my name is Judy, and I'm a second-year Master's of Public Health student at UBC and a sustainability scholar with Fraser Basin Council and the UBC Sustainability Initiative, which I'll talk more about in just a second. So first off, I just want to acknowledge that I'm presenting today from the ancestral, unceded, and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And my report was also prepared while living and working on these territories. So as mentioned previously, I'm a sustainability scholar with FBC and UBC. The UBC Sustainability Scholars Program is an internship opportunity that matches UBC graduate students with sustainability partners to work on applied research projects that advance sustainability across the region. And I wanted to provide a little context on how I became interested in the topic of climate grief and how I ended up being a sustainability scholar, as a lot of my previous experiences have influenced the way in which I approached this project. So my passion for climate action and justice really started at a young age, probably sometime around grade 2. I remember a lot of the school activities we did included themes of saving the planet or not littering, which really informed and planted the seed for my interest in climate action. And continuing into high school, I was involved in a lot of environmental stewardship activities and even started an eco club at my school. And as someone who was growing up with the climate crisis, there definitely was a sense of urgency and frustration that was already growing in me at that stage. I remember going to summer camp in high school, and I would sit by the campfire and share scary stories with the other camp participants. And my go-to story was simply to state the words climate change as the scariest story ever, and nothing else. So even back then, I felt this impending doom, or what we call now eco-anxiety. And a lot of the times I felt like very few people around me were feeling the same way, especially my participants or co-participants at my camp. So this interest in climate action and environmental conservation led me to pursue a biology degree at UBC because I wanted to study the ecological effects of climate change. But as most people experience, university doesn't exactly go the way you plan, and I ended up doing a co-op position at BC Children's Hospital, where I started thinking about pursuing a career in the health field. I also became more interested in mental health and improving access to mental health support. So for instance, I ended up starting Vancouver's first peer support group for people with borderline personality disorder to try and provide informal support for those waiting to receive treatment. And these experiences led me to pursue a Master's of Public Health at UBC to try and improve mental health support specifically within youth populations. And although my passion for climate action was still there, it had taken a backseat to my more recent endeavors. And in my practicum this past summer, I was able to work at the BC CDC, working on the Youth Development Instrument, which is a youth mental health survey project. And when I started, my supervisor gave me the choice of working on a few topics, one of which was climate change anxiety in youth. And when she gave me that option, I kind of immediately sort of pounced on it because I thought, what a great way to get back into the topic of climate change. And through my research on climate anxiety in youth this summer, I was able to write a commentary on the lack of literature and measurement on youth climate anxiety, which was published in the Lancet Planetary Health this past September. And the summer experience really allowed me to merge these two main interests of mine, being climate change and climate action, with mental health in a way that I hadn't considered previously. So when the opportunity to work on a climate grief project with Fraser Basin Council came up, I was really excited to take on the position. And I've been working with FBC and my mentor, Kate Murphy, since October 2020 to prepare these reports, which I'll be detailing for the rest of this presentation. So the definition in my scholars report is based off the definition by Consolo Analysis 2018 article, which states that climate grief is any grief felt in relation to experienced or anticipated ecological losses, including the loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to acute or chronic environmental change. And this definition really covers the broad ways in which climate change can affect one's mental health and cause negative emotions. So I completed 2 reports for my project. The first one being a case studies report on interventions and programs that have been implemented to address situations of climate grief within populations, communities, and on the individual level. And the second report is a toolkit for climate grief and includes types of activities that one can implement within a group setting or individually to help address and cope with climate grief. So the case studies report is further broken down into interventions external to a climate disaster, as well as case studies associated with a climate disaster. There are 10 case studies in the external to a climate disaster section, and these interventions are focused on those experiencing climate or eco-anxiety, as well as chronic solastalgia, which is the grief associated with slow but chronic changes to one's homeland or environment. And case studies in the other section are focused on mental health and resilience support before or after the occurrence of a climate disaster. And there are 8 case studies in the report that are drawn from communities that have experienced hurricanes and extreme weather events, flooding, as well as long-term drought. And each case study includes information on the location of the case study, objectives of the intervention, a description of what was implemented, lessons learned, and considerations, as well as evaluations when available. And additionally, for those case studies associated with a climate disaster, they're differentiated between direct versus indirect methods. Direct methods being explicitly related to mental health concerns and providing support in that regard, whereas indirect methods of addressing climate grief would include both community and individual resilience that may not necessarily seem to be related with mental health, but ultimately work to increase preparedness and ability to cope, thus being likely to decrease the potential negative effects associated with a climate event. So I wanted to provide some examples of case studies in the report. So likely one of the most well-known interventions for climate grief is the work that Reconnects, developed by Joanna Macy. So the objective of the work that Reconnects is to help participants acknowledge, experience, and understand the emotions that may empower or inhibit action related to the current ecological and climate crisis. It draws from practices of deep ecology, systems theory, eco-psychology, Buddhism, and political activism, and is a transformative learning experience delivered by trained facilitators in single-day sessions or multiple long-term sessions. So there are 4 main stages to the process that build upon one another. The first involves gratitude practices, which allows participants to reconnect with empathy, and this could involve exercises as simple as listing things you're grateful for to the rest of the group. The next stage is honoring our pain for the world, which allows space for participants to feel their emotions and honor the pain and distress they may be feeling. And oftentimes this is quite an emotional step as participants engage deeply with heavy emotions, but it is a really important step in addressing one's climate grief. The next stage moves into seeing with new eyes, which allows participants to shift perspectives by considering the positionality of others. The intention of this step and its activities is to have participants build a more inclusive perspective and sense of self to better respond and handle challenges. And lastly, the 4th stage is going forth, which is focused on having participants take the learnings from the previous steps and reflect on ways in which the learnings can be incorporated in their daily lives, particularly highlighting the need for active hope moving forward. So in an article that reviewed the impacts of a one-day Work That Reconnects workshop, participants were found to enjoy the use of various sensory experiences through the mind, body, and imagination to build community with other participants. And a number of participants were also motivated to continue practicing meditation. And the workshop was mostly deemed a positive and insightful experience. However, due to the length of the workshop, participants also felt that the inspiration and learnings they gained from the workshop would quickly dissipate, which provides a reason for implementation of continuous and long-term support models rather than one-time interventions when considering climate grief. So in another example to address climate grief, particularly eco-anxiety, humor was used as a way to try and address climate change communication and emotions related to climate grief. And this intervention, Stand Up for Climate Change, was one that really resonated with me as someone who often uses humor to approach an emotional situation. So the intervention was at the University of Boulder, Colorado, and it's an annual comedy show that gets put on about climate change. Undergraduate students, usually within the environmental sciences major, can prepare a stand-up routine, skit, or form an improv group to be included in the show. And the show is presented to other undergraduate students as well as friends and families of the performers. So based on the article written by Boykoff and Osnes, the two faculty members who coordinate the show each year, audience members reported humor as an effective coping method to provide relief from distressing climate emotions, as well as an effective method to learn about climate change. However, it can become a fine line with the use of humor to address serious topics, but audience members didn't find the show to trivialize climate change. And here are a few quotes from the audience feedback survey. So it showed me how fun climate communication can be, which helps to reframe the whole conversation in a way that feels more manageable. And the show made it easier to bring up the subject of climate change without being depressing. And the approaches for addressing climate grief between the Work That Reconnects, which I talked about earlier, and Stand Up for Climate Change are significantly different, yet both are found to be effective in helping people cope. Which implies that there is potential for a vast variety of climate grief interventions that could be employed in the future. They also have recordings of all of the Stand Up for Climate Change shows, and that is available through their website, which is linked in my report that will be shared later. And also, I just wanted to quickly highlight the second section of the report, which includes case studies related to a climate change disaster. And oftentimes these interventions are implemented at the community level due to their widespread effects. But I won't delve too much into this section as Dr. Dickin will be speaking more so from the community perspective after my presentation. And now for the rest of my presentation, I'll just speak to the second report, which is the activities toolkit. So the purpose of this toolkit is to provide readers with a variety of different activities that anyone could implement in their own life to address and cope with climate grief. The report is written to be used in a group setting, but a large proportion of activities can be easily adapted for individual use. So the toolkit was informed by the literature search into academic and non-academic sources. A lot of the sources I included in my case studies report were used to identify important activity themes for addressing climate grief. In addition to the literature search, I also conducted interviews and had the opportunity to speak with a number of climate change practitioners, climate grief intervention facilitators, and mental health professionals such as counselors to get a first-hand perspective on the types of activities that one could use to address climate grief. And from these sources, I distilled the toolkit down to 7 main activities that I'll go over in just a few slides. Now, the report includes an introduction, a facilitator notes section, which details considerations and tips for those thinking about starting some sort of climate grief intervention group. And this is followed by a section that details 2 group frameworks that could be used to start a climate grief support group among one's peers or workplace or greater community. I've also included considerations when running a support group, which was informed a lot by my own experience running the BPD mental health support group. And the toolkit then details the activity types with a broad overview of each theme and then an example activity. So the 7 activity types include icebreakers to help participants get to know one another, mindfulness activities such as breathing practice and meditations, gratitude practices that encourage participants to express gratitude in various aspects of their life, ecotherapy activities that are nature-based and focus on reconnecting participants with nature, practices that help participants name and address their emotions related to the climate crisis, grief activities that are specifically focused on what has been lost in the situation, And lastly, grounding exercises to help participants come back from intense emotions. And in particular, I wanted to detail a grief activity that I personally found to be incredibly impactful, and it's called Bowl of Tears from the work that reconnects. So in this activity, the facilitator starts by placing a bowl that is about a third full of water. The water represents the tears for the world. And participants are in a circle around the bowl, and anyone is invited to come to the center and place their hand in the water. They raise their hand and let the water trickle down their fingers back into the bowl as they finish the prompt, "My tears are for," and then something that they are mourning the loss of. And they then return to their place as another member approaches the bowl. And after everyone has had the opportunity to share, the group moves together to a green space, such as a garden or a nearby forest, and the water is poured out while the group says a collective statement, such as, "Our tears for the world are our tears for Gaia." And what I thought was really beautiful about this activity and grief activities in general is the space it holds to honor feelings that people usually try to suppress or avoid. And it does so in a collective manner that encourages relationship building and collective mourning of a shared experience. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Here are the covers for my 2 reports, and they are being submitted today, as is the last day of the project. And it will also be made available to the public through the project library on the UBC Sustainability website. And as mentioned, that link will be shared at the end of this webinar. And thank you again for taking the time out today to hear about my project, and I invite any questions that people may have.
Oh, thanks so much, Judy. Lots of interesting examples that I'm sure a lot of us are excited to get our hands on that toolkit, which will be available shortly. So thank you for sharing that. And it was also really great to see some parallels between what Renee was presenting about the need to create safe spaces for us to be having connections with each other, and some of the social activities that you had found in your research. I'm curious, I don't see any questions from the slide in the chat. So if you have one for Judy, please put it in there, because we'll have some more time for discussion after our final panelist presentation. I did have one question for you, Judy. You spoke with a lot of resilience experts who focused on climate change related mental health impacts. And we know that eco-anxiety for young people in particular is something that is really prominent and challenging. Is there one example that you found in your research that really stands out as something that was specifically supporting youth and young people? Is there something that you found that you'd like to share around for that population?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, and this kind of goes back to my work this summer, looking at climate anxiety specifically in youth. And basically what my commentary that I mentioned earlier details is that there really isn't anything specific for youth, because climate grief and eco-anxiety are still quite new in terms of the academic literature. So interventions that are only just starting to be explored are being looked at more in the general population versus like with a particular focus in youth. And what we know about youth is the way that stress and anxiety, the way that affects their development and their bodies is different than it would be for an adult. So the potential negative consequences that could result from this consistent eco-anxiety that somebody might be experiencing could really cause long-term health effects. Mm-hmm. But that being said, a lot of the interventions that I detail in my report and also just in my presentation, they are applicable to youth and can be used within those populations. And I have started to see a shift towards having youth focused group. So instead of just having an open general support group for everybody, there might be one that is specific for people who are 24 and under or 18 and under. There's also what I've seen is sort of a move now towards parent groups and having parents better understand eco-anxiety and how that might be affecting their child, and providing supports that way in terms of supporting their children. So to summarize, unfortunately, no, there isn't anything specific, or not at least something that I've come across. Okay. But I think the what is happening now is that there is a shift towards it, and it looks like things are moving towards a better situation in terms of providing support for youth.
I'll put, there's a few questions in the chat, so thank you for those, and we'll save those for the discussion after. Just one final question, which I think is a good segue into our final panelist, Judy. There's a question from Ellen Pond. Hi, Ellen. Is asking, is there work that you found that intersects climate grief, decolonization, and anti-racist work? Did you find any examples that were really bringing a decolonial lens to the climate grief work?
Yeah, just thinking back to my reports, and I don't actually think many of the case studies that I had looked at kind of took that approach, particularly regarding eco-anxiety. Again, because eco-anxiety and the supports that are available for people experiencing that are, I would say, like somewhat more prevalent in the Western world as opposed to more like low-income countries. So I think what needs to be done is like there needs to be that greater focus on colonialism and decolonization of eco-anxiety in these practices, and a higher focus on non-Western countries or as well as low-income countries. Of the work that details the case studies to do with a climate change disaster, I did see the incorporation of community stakeholders and local populations to really try and make those interventions more applicable to the context of the situation. So, for example, one of the case studies I detail is in Haiti, and it's a mindfulness intervention and disaster preparedness intervention for people living in the capital there. And the way that they conducted it was not just researchers coming in from like a North American institution, but they consulted and worked a lot with the local Haitian organizations there, and were able to develop and form this this more inclusive and community-informed context. So again, to summarize it, I think the disaster literature in regards is a little bit more ahead in that aspect, but I think there is going to be a shift towards that as you know, anti-racism and colonialism topics are so prevalent in today's culture.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's so. Thank you so much, Judy, and we'll look forward to welcoming you back for at the end of this webinar. I'll invite Dr. Emily Dicken, our final panelist, to turn your video on. This is a great segue into Emily's presentation. So we've heard from Renee about how grief is a natural response to what's happening to our world, and that our pathways to address the climate crisis may in fact need to move towards these difficult feelings and exploring them together in a safe way. We've heard from Judy about a number of studies and examples relating to how we can address eco-anxiety and climate grief. And our final panelist is bringing a perspective of someone who has worked directly with communities at the community level, with those communities who have experienced impacts from climate change directly. And so I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Emily Dicken. Emily's worked as a practitioner in the field of emergency management for 15 years. She's held various positions working for the province of BC in health emergency management and also with First Nations Health Authority. And she's now in the role of Director of North Shore Emergency Management, and she's supporting disaster response and resilience building initiatives. And Emily also is an academic, and through her academic work, her central focus is on understanding colonialism as an unnatural and enduring disaster impacting Indigenous communities. So welcome, Emily. I'll turn it over to you.
Super, thanks. I'm just going to do a check-in. Carrie, you can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm joining today from my office on the North Shore, which is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish Nation, the Musqueam Nation, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And I'm really thankful to be here today. This is a bit of a talk that I thought was a bit outside my wheelhouse until I really started to think about what my experience has looked like over the past 15 years working in emergency management and walking alongside First Nation communities in their experiences of disaster. And so I'd just like to share some of those insights and some of that experience with you guys today. So, and my apologies, I'm not very technologically savvy, and so I'm going to have somebody else drive my slides for me today. So if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. So just a bit of an introduction to myself. I come from the Little Red River Cree Nation on my father's side, and on my mother's side, I have a mixed British descent. I've spent my entire life growing up in British Columbia, in and amongst the Coast Mountains. And it's really where I got the foundations, and my foundations for my love of environment, but also my love of the complexity that disasters kind of bring into our spaces of community and into our spaces of life and our connections to the places and spaces that we live. It was really my work in emergency management that kind of fueled these questions that I had about the inequities that happen during disasters and about how to close those gaps and barriers for all spaces of the population, but really primarily First Nation communities and Indigenous populations. Just a bit about myself. I am a mom to 2 young boys, and I live on the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish Nation and Lillooet Nation up in Whistler, BC. The reason why I mention that is because I'll talk about it a little bit further in my presentation, but as a practitioner working through these dynamic spaces of disaster that are becoming more frequent and more severe in my working world, it's been so important to ground my space in wellness and really honor that time and that space that I find to recoup and recover. And a big part of that is finding my wellness in my community and in the mountains that I live in. And a really big part of my work that I'm going to share with you today is a lot more of my research-based work, which is really looking at the inequalities that we see during disasters and how these inequalities are exacerbated really between this interface between the climate crisis that we're experiencing, how that crisis is influencing the frequency and intensity of events, how those events are impacting our space of wellness and our space of mental health, and then how all of these pieces come together and are so intrinsically connected to the Indian Act and other oppressive spaces of legislation and colonization that are actually creating and exacerbating spaces of risk for First Nation communities. So we'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a lot about disproportionate risk related to climate-related disasters. This became really apparent for me, and I would say the later part of my career as an emergency manager, and really predominantly from this became so aware for me from the 2017 fires, the 2018 wildfire seasons, and some of the freshet experiences, so the spring flooding that happened between those 2 seasons. And it really started to become poignant for me when I started to look at how services were delivered on reserve, but also how the legislation that kind of governs or overrides what reserve land looks like, and how services and supports are provided on reserve unfold, how those pieces start to create really disproportionate impacts for disaster. And what we see is that colonization has really exacerbated risk through a lot of key areas, but for me the most poignant is really the loss of land and the placement of reserves. For many First Nation communities across BC and Indigenous communities across Canada, the placement of reserve was something that communities sometimes didn't have a lot of say in, and if they did have say in, there were really critical and strong thresholds around how land was used and around the size of the reserve as a whole, not taking into consideration what territorial lands look like or how communities move through those territorial lands in terms of seasonal mitigation efforts and in terms of adaptation strategies. So for instance, communities not spending winters in areas of their traditional territory that would be susceptible to storm surge or susceptible to significant flooding, and taking refuge in areas of their territory that would be safer during regular seasonal hazard cycles. And through the reserve section of the Indian Act, a lot of those practices were oppressively lost through the legislation. And then when we think of other elements of oppressive colonial practices, we see the loss of language, the loss of traditional governance structures within Indigenous communities. And for both of these pieces have really critical impacts to how communities were able to utilize language, were able to utilize traditional histories and oral histories around hazards and risks, and then translating those histories into adaptive strategies to manage those risks, as well as the governance structures and the capacity structures to deal with the frequency and intensity of events that are impacting communities on reserve. I'm now working in a space where I'm working in local government in the municipal space. And what I realize is that, especially for the municipal space on the North Shore, there's an incredible depth of knowledge that's been built over time through these municipalities. It's a space where leadership has been built and cultivated over time. The ability to manage risk and risk awareness has been developed through research and through planning practices and principles over time. And what we see is that the resilience in the communities that I'm working in and serving in right now, there's just this wonderful depth of information that has been built through resources and capacity. And it wasn't something that was built overnight. And so when we look at the imposition of colonial structures onto First Nation communities, there's often an assumption that First Nation communities will respond in the same way that their local government counterparts are responding to disaster events. But there simply hasn't been the capacity investment and the planning or technical investments that have been made in many local government settings. So in many ways, there's not a level setting that's allowing communities, First Nation communities, to sometimes be at the same place, or the beautiful knowledge that is held through traditional practices and oral histories often isn't seen to have the same value or to have the same rigor or scientific rigor that the technical or scientific information will have. So it can often be discredited from a technical or scientific perspective, even though from a community perspective, it has a deep wealth and a really incredible significance. In the next slide, I'm also going to talk about intergenerational. Let's just move to the next slide. Definitely. So I really want to move the conversation into what compounding disasters and complex trauma looks like. And I feel like it's a really critical point of discussion for this topic. When I think about my career as a whole, and I look over the 15 years of my career, there have been really kind of quiet times, I'm not kind of knocking on wood, because there's been really quiet times in my career where flooding and fire events have been significantly less frequent, they've been less intense, and they haven't come in as frequent cycles as what we see now. A lot of my career was spent at the provincial level of work, so it was really looking at a series of disaster events on a provincial scale as opposed to a local scale. So what I was seeing and experiencing as a practitioner was really from 2017 on, these high frequency, high intensity events from flooding to fire, and just this sequential cycle. When I worked with FNHA, I had the privilege of working with their interior team, and they had been collecting data on a lot of the events that they had been part of in terms of responding to with community. And on the right side of this slide is just a sequence of events that had happened for their staff and for the communities that they work with. And they started to notice that these were really compounding events that were causing complex trauma in their communities. Some are events that are fueled by the impacts and changes associated with climate change, and others are accidents or just other consequences of community or spaces of health like the opioid crisis. But there are all of these spaces in community and these hazard and traumatic experiences in community that are causing the deterioration of mental health conditions in the community. And with that deteriorating conditions, it just creates further pressure on the resources in community that are there to manage, support communities through these crisis events. And it was just really eye-opening for me as an emergency management practitioner to work in the space of wellness and health, and work with mental health practitioners to see how our work is colliding and how it's creating these really considerable pressures for community. We'll go to the next slide. I wanted to share one experience, and this is just more from a story perspective and an experience that I had as a practitioner, but it really changed me as an individual, and it changed how I saw disasters and how I saw disasters impacting First Nation communities primarily. This is a flooding story that it's not a story, it's a flooding experience of for me that really combined the interface of climate change, environmental change, the frequency intensity of disasters, and the space of colonization. This is the story of Dewadenuk. It's in Kinkum Inlet on the central coast of BC, and it was a flooding experience that I was part of really early in my career. I didn't really start working in emergency management until about 2006, so I was only about a year into my career, and I was on call at the time as the Ministry of Health duty officer when this flooding event happened. And I went through this flooding event like I would normally any event, partnered with Emergency Management BC, neighboring municipalities, the regional district, the First Nation themselves, worked through the evacuation process, and then went through and supported the evacuees that were removed from their community. And this event had a really specific impact on me because it impacted a lot of good friends that I had that were from this community. It was a number of friends that I had played soccer with on my soccer team in Victoria, and a lot of their family members were still living in this community. And when I went to soccer the next week, I said, oh, I was responding to an event, a flooding event in your community, and the amount of devastation and grief that they were experiencing was something that I wasn't really prepared to deal with. I had thought from my perspective as a practitioner that the response was going relatively well, that we had done as an emergency management practice what we were trained to do, which was to support the community to evacuate to a neighboring community and into a safe place. And there had been psychosocial supports deployed to support impacted community members going through the event. But what I really didn't understand was the intergenerational devastation that the community was experiencing. And it was because they would have never have wintered in this community. It was a summer village. And it was a summer village primarily based around access to salmon and other elements of food harvesting and food security. And they would then winter in another space of their traditional territory. And they did this simply because they knew there were really high risks to being in this part of their territory during the winter months, and they were exposed to king tide events as well as really intense rainstorms. But what further exacerbates this flooding event was the fact that there was deforestation upriver from them, and it actually changed the way that the river navigates in through their community. And instead of taking a more meandering route, it actually runs much quicker and much faster through their community. So during a high tide event and a Pineapple Express type storm, which are coming more frequently and more severely now, the community is experiencing much more rapid flooding events and much more significant flooding events. And for me, the compounding nature of how the reserve section of the Indian Act created and fueled this space of risk for this community was something that was really hard for me to grapple with as a practitioner. And it was really my first experience at how significantly disproportionately First Nation communities and Indigenous communities across Canada are impacted on the front line of what the climate crisis will look like. And so this was actually the event that fueled me to start a PhD and really dig into this. And it really changed the way that I moved through my work as a practitioner of emergency management. So I just wanted to share it with everyone because I felt like it was just an important story for me. And I'm cognizant of the time, so I'll go through the next two slides quite quickly. If we could go to the next slide. I'm going to start talking about, okay, so the next slide, and I wasn't sure whether it was okay to share this or not, but this was a slide that emerged for me out of the Understanding Risk Symposium a few months ago that I was part of, and it was an opportunity to convene speakers on Indigenous wellness. And for me, it was just a really great grounding in terms of all the spaces that we can look for wellness to support our journey, whether we're being impacted by these events as individuals in our community, or whether we're practitioners supporting communities through these deeply challenging events. And both are critically important to support ourselves and to support communities. But really understanding that resilience starts in the space of community, and there are so many gifts in community to support wellness and to support that recovery process. And I know that these slides will be shared, so I'll let folks go through these slides at their own pace, but it's really thinking about the physical elements of wellness, the emotional, the spiritual, and the mental elements of wellness, and honoring that space and finding that support as practitioners and impacted communities on how we can create that journey of healing. And I'll just go to the last slide. And for me as a practitioner in emergency management, this has been incredibly important. It was something that I didn't really recognize throughout my entire career, but after the fires of 2017 and more 2018, I started to really recognize that I was experiencing really intense burnout and fatigue as a practitioner, and I really wasn't honoring my own wellness, but I started to realize that I was the only one that could do that for myself. And so I worked with my employer, which was Emergency Management BC at the time, to advocate for myself. I knew that I needed to be in the mountains to kind of reclaim my wellness. I knew it was a place that I could recharge and refuel. And so I advocated for a telework environment so that I could move myself, my husband, and our two young sons to Whistler and find a better balance for myself. And be able to come to work in a better way and be able to continue to kind of fuel this work that I'm doing. I will say, though, it's not lost on me that my space of wellness is intimately connected into the space of the climate crisis, and that I do worry about what my small mountain town will look like over the years to come, and what this continuing pressure and impact of climate change will look like for my mountain community that is so dependent on winter and on chilly days. So I will leave it there. I feel, oh, maybe we'll go to the next. I have a last slide, and I think it's just such a beautiful little picture of what regrowth looks like. It was a picture that was taken after the 2017 wildfires, and I was just out in community and took this picture, and it just reminds me that there's always room to grow, and there's always kind of brighter days ahead. And yeah, and I guess just to be in that hopeful space and know that we're all kind of walking through this journey together. But I will just leave it there. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Emily. And you know, this is in this webinar, we've covered a lot of territory. Mental health and climate change, it's a broad topic, right? So it includes things like eco-anxiety, but it also includes the direct impacts on communities. And I'm just really grateful for you bringing the stories of the communities that you've worked with. Something that really stood out for me that is so critical is the colonial foundations of some of these climate impacts in communities, and how they may be exacerbating mental health impacts where there's a connection to land or traditional practices that have been disrupted. You know, many on this call, I'm assuming either work in the field of emergency management or support communities in climate change adaptation. And Emily, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how our understanding of resilience, like as a field, may need to change or evolve to kind of better understand or include some of these mental health and wellness considerations.
Yeah, when I think about the considerations for mental health and wellness, I think substantial change is happening already and is underway. If I think about what my experience looked like when I first started my career as opposed to what it looks like now, I think it looks fundamentally different. I think about the supports that are available for practitioners in the midst of response and following response. And I think about even how we're holding these spaces of conversations within our field of practice. It's profoundly different. And I think about the offerings from the offerings at conferences, even just to how we're kind of, yeah, holding each other up on a daily basis. I know that we weren't having these types of conversations 15 years ago, and I feel like we've normalized this within the field. And so I can only imagine that through these normalizing practices, what we'll start to see is people and planners actually coming to our work and coming to our field specifically in these roles. I know right now I'm looking to hire a manager of planning and resilience. I know that a position down the road that I want to have is somebody that really solely looks at community recovery and the intersections of that. And I know that I'm not the only one thinking about this, and so I can only imagine how much the field will change over the next 5 years even.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks for sharing that. And I know there's a lot of questions that we're not going to be able to get to, unfortunately. But I think as just a closing thought and a question to either Emily or Judy. So Judy, feel free to join us with your camera back on. I'll just try and make a link, I guess, across the presentations and the panelists today. So, I mean, a theme I heard across them all was that in order to be able to hold kind of a safe space for others to heal, to share, to be with these difficult emotions, that we need to be able to be with these emotions ourselves. And so for those of us that do this work, there's an element, it seems, of personal care that can't be left out. And Emily, thank you for sharing your own story of how you kind of self-advocated in order to be able to do this work, you needed to have support in your organization to be caring for your own personal health and well-being. I'm just curious if either of you, Judy or Emily, in a closing thought, would like to share any other ideas you have about how organizations can support the people within their organizations to be supported to take care of their own personal mental health and wellness in relation to environmental change or climate change. Anything that any tips or ideas of what we can do you know, if you're working for an organization and listening right now and you want to be able to support this work, building capacity.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I might add there is to, I think, just hold the space and hold the time. And this is very specific to emergency management, but I mean, our responses that we face are very cyclical. We know that anxiety might build at certain times of the year, like right now as we're moving into freshet season, or as we move through the summer, anxieties can spike as a result of the wildfire season. And I think we need to prepare that these anxieties are only going to build and become more frequent. So as organizations, how do we put the tools in place to help manage that level of staff anxiety? And I think there's so many ways to go about doing that, from having check-ins with staff to having shared times to eat together, which doesn't work during COVID, but coming together and actually just enjoying the time together, building those trusted relationships so that when people are having a tricky day, they have that safety net to lean on, and they have a whole kind of depth of people that they can go out and get that support from. And again, just building that space for, I think, the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual wellness, and recognizing that it's so interconnected.
Love that. Thank you, Emily. And we're running short on time, so I'll thank you right now. And I'm going to turn it to Judy if she has any thoughts, and then also to take us into your last slide around tools and resources. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. And just to add on what Dr. Dickman was saying, like having that space in a workplace to hold for climate grief and eco-anxiety and other heavy emotions, I think will be really important. And something that I mentioned in my presentation as well as my reports is the creation of some sort of support group for climate grief. And Dr. Lertzman talked about this as well earlier in her presentation, but having sort of a psychologist or a psychiatrist or somebody who is with mental health training to be able to kind of facilitate that. But the resources that I have in my support are meant for people who are meant for people to employ them without any sort of mental health background, and really is more of a peer support network. And again, just creating that and having that support, and knowing that, you know, that you're not the only one feeling this way, and leaning on those, the social cohesion, I think, is really important. And just to wrap up, I don't have a final slide, but I just wanted to mention some additional resources that people can check out. So we have, and I think they're going to be posted in the chat. The links will be posted, so you'll have a reference to what I'm talking about right now. So we have the Mental Health and Climate Change Alliance, and that is a collaboration between some local universities, including SFU, UVic, and I believe UBC, and they are a resource for people to look at the mental health impacts of climate change, and better understand the impacts, as well as the ways that one can address them, as well as Climate in Mind, which is sort of like a hub of all things climate change related, and grief or eco-anxiety, or just in general climate change education. And this is something that I use to inform my reports a lot, and it's a really great resource, and they're really comprehensive, and also they take suggestions. So if you do find something or come across something that is related to climate change, you can send them an email and they'll post it on their website, and I'll probably send a link to my report as well. And I just lastly wanted to highlight 2 more support groups. So Good Grief Network is a fairly new support group. It's similar to the work that reconnects, but it is it's a 10-week session, and you can read more about it in my report. As well as Carbon Conversations. This one is more to do with CO2 emissions and reducing that. But it uses an emotional and emotional focused and fear focused sort of aspect to look at that. So again, thank you so much, everybody, and I'll hand it back to Carrie.
Thank you. Just so much gratitude for your time and for sharing your experience, your wisdom, your stories today. It's been really fantastic. Kate, did you have any closing words on behalf of Fraser Basin Council?
Just my immense gratitude for both of you for joining us today and sharing this knowledge and taking the time. I know both of you are incredibly busy in your work and your life, so I'm so grateful that you could join us. And I'm going to be rewatching this webinar to make sure that I didn't miss anything as I was checking the comments and the questions.
Great, thank you. And I believe the slides will be available, and we will be able to get those to you. So thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day, wonderful spring day.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.